I never thought silence could be so loud until that night on the back porch, with rain falling like whispered confessions around us. The drops caught the amber light from the kitchen window, each one a tiny amber bead suspended in the darkness before gravity claimed it. Midnight had come and gone without either of us acknowledging it, the way time seems to bend when you're standing at the edge of something that might change everything. Desmond sat in the old wicker chair I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years, his long fingers wrapped around a beer bottle that had gone warm an hour ago. He looked different than he had at 18. Sharper somehow, like the world had carved away everything soft and left only the essential parts. His dark hair was shorter now, touched with silver at the temples that caught the light when he turned his head. But his eyes were the same. God, his eyes were exactly the same. The rain had started as a drizzle during dinner, Fiona commenting that we'd need to move the conversation inside soon. But somehow we'd let it build to this steady rhythm against the roof, against the leaves of the oak tree that stretched over half the yard, and neither of us had suggested leaving. We'd been talking for hours about nothing important: his mother's health, the changes in town since he'd been gone, the art gallery he'd run in Portland before everything fell apart. Safe topics. Careful words. The kind of conversation you have when everything you really want to say lives in the spaces between sentences. I watched him through the veil of rain, noting how he held himself differently now. At 18, Desmond had been all nervous energy and wild gestures, hands constantly moving as if they could catch the words he couldn't quite form. Now he sat still, composed, like someone who'd learned to hold his secrets close. 15 years of living in cities I'd only seen in movies, 15 years of being whoever he wanted to be, had given him a quiet confidence that made my chest tight with something I didn't want to name. The hardware store would open in 7 hours. Liam had soccer practice at 9. Fiona was already asleep upstairs, her breathing deep, and even in the way that meant she'd taken her allergy medication. These were the facts of my life, solid and predictable as the mortgage payment that came due every month. But they felt distant now, like things happening to someone else while I sat here in the amber light and rain-soaked darkness with the boy who used to sneak through my bedroom window when we were 17. When I finally spoke, my voice came out rougher than I intended. I'd been thinking the words for so long they felt worn smooth, like stones I'd been carrying in my pocket. I still think about you. The admission hung in the air between us, as fragile and dangerous as spun glass. I waited for him to flinch, to laugh, to do something that would let me take it back and pretend I'd meant something else entirely. But Desmond just looked at me with those dark eyes that had haunted 15 years of careful choices, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition, like he'd been waiting for me to say it. The rain seemed to grow quieter, or maybe I'd stopped hearing it over the sound of my own heartbeat. I could see the kitchen through the window behind him, could see the little magnetic letters Liam had arranged on the refrigerator to spell out random words. Truck, blue, dad. Simple things that belonged to the life I'd built, the life that made sense on paper. Desmond set down his beer bottle with the careful precision of someone who'd had just enough to drink that his movements required thought. When he looked at me again, there was something soft in his expression, something that reminded me of the boy who used to lie on his back in the tall grass behind the school and point out constellations he was making up as he went along. "We can try," he said, and his voice was quiet enough that I had to lean forward to catch the words. "But only if it stays between us." The condition hung there like a door opening into a room I wasn't sure I was allowed to enter. I could feel the weight of everything it implied. The secrecy, the careful choreography of hidden moments, the life split cleanly down the middle between what was real and what was visible. Part of me wanted to tell him that wasn't enough, that I was too old for half measures and stolen kisses in dark corners. But a larger part of me, the part that had been holding its breath for 15 years, felt something unlock in my chest at the possibility. I thought about Fiona upstairs, probably dreaming of the vacation we'd been planning to take next summer. I thought about Liam's laugh when I pushed him on the swing set last weekend, the way he still reached for my hand when we crossed busy streets. I thought about the mortgage and the car payments and the college fund we'd been contributing to since the day he was born. All of it solid, all of it real, all of it mine. But Desmond's eyes held the same softness I remembered from when we were young and stupid and thought love was simple. Before I learned that wanting something and being allowed to have it were two different things entirely. before I understood that some doors, once opened, can never quite be closed again. The rain kept falling, blurring the edges of the world until it felt like we were the only two people left in it. Somewhere in the distance, a car drove past with its headlights cutting through the darkness, reminding me that morning would come whether I was ready for it or not. But for now, in this suspended moment between one life and another, I could feel something forbidden and fated opening up in the space between us. I didn't say yes, not yet, but I didn't say no either, and we both knew that silence was an answer all its own. The morning after came with the reliable cruelty of an alarm clock at 6:30. I woke to find Fiona already in the shower, the sound of water running through the pipes a familiar percussion that had marked the beginning of our days for 12 years. Liam was still sleeping, one arm flung over his pillow in the careless way children sleep when the world hasn't yet taught them to hold themselves carefully. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling fan that squeaked on every third rotation, trying to reconcile the man who had sat in the rain with Desmond until nearly 2 in the morning with the man who needed to make coffee and pack lunches and pretend that nothing fundamental had shifted in the architecture of his life. The house looked exactly the same in daylight. Wedding photos still lined the hallway. Fiona in white lace, me in a rented tuxedo that had been too tight in the shoulders, both of us young and certain about the future we were stepping into. Family vacations to lakes and theme parks smiled down from their frames, documenting years of careful happiness. Christmas mornings and birthday parties and school plays, all the moments that were supposed to add up to a life well lived. I made coffee in the same blue mug I'd used for 5 years, standing at the kitchen counter where Desmond and I had talked until Fiona went to bed. In daylight, it was just a counter again, granite we'd chosen together from sample books, practical and timeless. But I could still feel the ghost of his presence there, the way he'd leaned against it while talking about the gallery he'd run in Portland, how his fingers had drummed against the surface when he talked about coming home. Fiona emerged from upstairs dressed for her job at the elementary school, her auburn hair pulled back in the neat bun she wore every day. She was pretty in the way that photographs well, with clear skin and kind eyes and a smile that put parents at ease during conferences. We'd met in college, both education majors who believed in the importance of steady work and shared values. She was everything my mother had hoped I'd find: responsible, intelligent, from a good family that attended church on Sundays and believed in marriage as a partnership of equals. She kissed my cheek while pouring her coffee, a gesture so automatic I wondered when we'd stopped really seeing each other during these morning rituals. Did she still think about the boy she'd met in Professor Miller's classroom, the one who'd talked about traveling and maybe teaching overseas someday? Or had that version of me been filed away with all the other dreams that get quietly set aside when real life begins? "Owen," she said, already checking her phone for the day's schedule. "Don't forget Liam has that project due tomorrow. The one about community helpers." I'd forgotten, of course, but I nodded and promised to help him finish it after dinner, adding it to the mental list of father duties that filled the margins of my days. Soccer practice and homework supervision and bedtime stories. All the ordinary responsibilities that made up the shape of love in a suburban house with good schools and safe streets. Liam appeared in the doorway wearing pajamas and bedhead, still small enough that he climbed onto my lap without asking. He smelled like sleep and the strawberry shampoo Fiona bought in bulk from the warehouse store. At 8, he was all knees and elbows and endless questions about why the world worked the way it did. He had Fiona's coloring, but something of my restlessness, always building elaborate structures with his blocks only to knock them down and start again. "Can Desmond come to my soccer game Saturday?" he asked, and the question hit me like cold water. He'd met Desmond exactly once, the previous evening when I'd introduced him as an old friend who was visiting town. But children have a radar for the adults who pay attention to them, and Desmond had spent 20 minutes examining Liam's latest Lego creation with the serious focus of an art critic. I told him maybe that Desmond might be busy helping his mother, but the truth was I hadn't thought about how to navigate this, how to explain a sudden friendship that would require careful scheduling and private conversations, how to justify the time I already wanted to spend with someone who made me remember who I used to be before I learned to want only safe things. The hardware store called to me like gravity. 22 years I'd been working there, first as a high school job that was supposed to be temporary, then full-time after Fiona got pregnant and we needed steady income with benefits. I knew every aisle, every supplier, every regular customer who came in looking for specific screws or paint colors or solutions to problems they couldn't quite articulate. It was honest work, useful work, the kind of job that let me provide for my family without asking too many questions about whether I was happy. But driving there that morning, I found myself taking the long way past Desmond's mother's house. Just a glimpse of his rental car in the driveway. Just the knowledge that he was there, 20 minutes from where I spent my days explaining the difference between wood screws and sheet metal screws to contractors who already knew the answer. The life I'd built was good by any reasonable measure. Stable mortgage payments and a retirement account that grew steadily, if unspectacularly. A son who hugged me goodbye every morning, and a wife who never questioned where I was or who I talked to. Friends from church and neighbors who waved from their driveways and invitations to barbecues, where we discussed lawn care and property taxes with the comfortable authority of people who belonged somewhere. But sitting in my car outside the hardware store, I realized I couldn't remember the last time any of it had felt like mine rather than like something I was performing. When had I stopped choosing this life and started simply inhabiting it? When had the boy who once carved his initials next to Desmond's in that oak tree become a man who measured his days in increments of duty and responsibility? I turned off the engine and went inside to begin another day of being the person everyone expected me to be. But for the first time in years, I could feel the difference between that person and whoever I might have been if I'd been braver when it mattered. 3 days passed before Desmond called. 3 days of me checking my phone between customers and finding reasons to drive past his mother's house on my lunch breaks, feeling like a teenager again in the most uncomfortable way possible. When his name finally appeared on my screen, I was standing in the paint aisle explaining color matching to Mrs. Henderson, and I nearly dropped the phone trying to answer it casually. He asked if I wanted to get coffee, nothing more complicated than that. But we both knew coffee meant conversation, and conversation with Desmond had already proven dangerous to the careful equilibrium I'd spent years perfecting. I told him yes anyway, because the alternative was pretending that night on the porch had never happened, and I'd discovered I wasn't strong enough for that kind of forgetting. We met at the diner on Route 9, the one with red vinyl booths and coffee that had been brewing since the Carter administration. It was the kind of place where nobody paid attention to anyone else's business, where truckers and shift workers came to eat pie and mind their own affairs. Safe, I thought. Neutral territory. But safety became irrelevant the moment Desmond slid into the booth across from me. He looked tired, older somehow than he had that night in the amber light. His mother's condition was worsening faster than the doctors had predicted, he explained. The house sale was complicated by decades of accumulated belongings and memories nobody knew how to sort through. He'd planned to stay a month, maybe 6 weeks. Now it looked like it might be longer. The news should have worried me. More time meant more opportunities for complications, more chances for the careful boundaries of my life to blur in ways I couldn't control. Instead, I felt something loosen in my chest, a relief I couldn't acknowledge out loud. We talked about his mother first, then the town and how it had changed since he'd left. New subdivisions where farms used to be, chain restaurants replacing the local places we'd known as kids. He asked about my work, about Fiona, about Liam, and I found myself describing my life as if it belonged to someone else. Good job, good kid, good marriage to a good woman. All the words that were true but somehow missed the point entirely. When he talked about Portland, about the gallery and the artists he'd worked with, his whole demeanor changed. His hands moved when he spoke, sketching shapes in the air as if he could make me see the paintings he'd loved, the exhibitions that had mattered. He'd lived in a loft above the gallery, he said, with windows that faced west toward the mountains. On clear days, he could see Mount Hood from his kitchen table. It was a life I couldn't quite imagine, waking up surrounded by art instead of mortgage statements, making decisions based on passion rather than practicality. But listening to him describe it, I could almost taste what that kind of freedom might feel like. The weight of always being responsible, always being the steady one, always choosing the safer path, seemed suddenly suffocating. The conversation shifted when he asked about the oak tree behind the school, whether it was still there. I told him it was, though they'd built a new parking lot that came within 20 feet of its trunk. We both knew what he was really asking about, Those initials we'd carved when we were 17 and stupid enough to think permanence was something you could create with a pocket knife. "Do you ever drive by there?" he asked, and something in his voice made me look up from my coffee. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Usually when I'm taking Liam to soccer practice. The field is right next to it." The silence that followed felt charged with all the things we weren't saying. I thought about those Saturday mornings, standing on the sidelines with the other parents, watching our kids chase a ball across grass, while that tree stood guard over secrets carved into its bark. How many times had I glanced at it, and wondered if Desmond ever thought about what we'd almost been? That evening, he called again. This time he suggested a drive, nothing fancy, just a chance to see how the countryside had changed. I told Fiona I was going to help him sort through some of his mother's things, and the lie came so easily it scared me. She barely looked up from grading papers, just reminded me not to be too late because Liam had an early game the next morning. We drove the back roads we'd explored as teenagers, windows down despite the October chill, talking about everything and nothing. He'd grown comfortable with silences in a way he never had when we were young, content to let conversations breathe and develop their own rhythm. When we finally stopped, it was at the old quarry where we used to swim in summers, the water black as ink under the stars. Standing at the edge of that familiar darkness, I felt the weight of every choice I'd made since leaving this place. College and marriage and parenthood, all the sensible decisions that had led me to a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt increasingly like a costume I couldn't take off. "We don't have to wonder anymore," Desmond said quietly, and when I turned to look at him, his face was serious in the moonlight. "We can try, but only if it stays between us." The words were almost exactly the same ones he'd spoken on my porch, but context had changed everything. This wasn't just about acknowledging old feelings anymore. This was about acting on them, about crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, about choosing, for once, something that felt real instead of something that looked right. I thought about Fiona at home, probably already asleep with a book folded open on her chest. About Liam's soccer game in the morning and the parent-teacher conference we had scheduled for Tuesday. About the life that would continue exactly as it always had if I simply said no and drove home to my responsibilities. But I also thought about the boy who'd carved those initials, who dreamed of seeing the world and making art and loving without apology, who'd believed, for one brief summer, that wanting something might be enough to make it possible. Standing there beside the quarry with Desmond's question hanging in the cool night air, I realized I was tired of being safe. Tired of choosing duty over desire. Tired of living a life that fit me like clothes borrowed from someone else. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I reached for his hand in the darkness, and when his fingers closed around mine, it felt like coming home to a place I'd forgotten I'd ever lived. The first kiss happened 3 nights later in the shadows beside the old Methodist church, where the streetlight had been broken for months and nobody bothered to fix it. We'd been walking after dinner at the diner, talking about nothing important, when Desmond stopped suddenly and turned to face me. The kiss was tentative at first, almost apologetic, as if he was giving me one last chance to change my mind. But when I didn't pull away, when I let myself lean into him instead, everything I'd been holding back for 15 years rushed to the surface at once. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Long enough for me to remember what it felt like to want something with my whole body, short enough that when it ended, I could almost pretend it hadn't happened at all. Almost. But the taste of him lingered on my lips during the drive home, and when I brushed my teeth that night, I was careful not to scrub too hard. Fiona was already asleep when I slipped into bed, her breathing deep and even in the way that meant she'd taken her medication. I lay beside her in the darkness, hyper-aware of every inch of space between us, listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling around us. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The oak tree scratching against the bedroom window. Liam coughing once in his sleep down the hall. All the ordinary noises of the life I'd built, suddenly feeling like they belonged to someone else. The transformation began slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. Changes so subtle I might not have noticed them if I hadn't been watching for them. I started checking my phone more often, deleting text messages before Fiona could accidentally see them. I volunteered to run errands that took me past Desmond's mother's house, just for the chance of glimpsing his car in the driveway. I found myself paying attention to my appearance in ways I hadn't since college, wondering if my hair looked too gray, or if the lines around my eyes made me look tired. We began meeting regularly, always somewhere different, always with plausible explanations I could offer if anyone asked. Coffee at the truck stop outside town. Walks through the state park where we'd hiked as teenagers. Long drives on back roads that led nowhere in particular, just miles of farmland and forest where we could talk without worrying about who might see us. Desmond was different than I remembered, sharper somehow, but also more fragile. 15 years of living openly had given him a confidence I envied, but I could see the cost of it too. He talked about relationships that had ended badly, about the loneliness of being the only openly gay man in small towns where he'd tried to build a life, about the way people looked at him sometimes, like he was something dangerous they needed to keep their children away from. But when he looked at me, none of that hardness was there. Instead, I found the boy I'd fallen in love with when we were 17 and thought we understood how the world worked. The one who'd made me laugh until my sides hurt, who'd listened to my plans for college and travel with the serious attention other people reserved for important news. Who'd made me feel, for one brief summer, like I was exactly who I was supposed to be. Our conversations grew more intimate as the weeks passed. He told me about the gallery in Portland, how it had failed not because he wasn't good at the work, but because he'd fallen in love with his business partner, a married man who'd promised to leave his wife and never did. I told him about the early years of my marriage, how Fiona and I had been happy in the beginning, how we'd planned to travel and maybe move somewhere more exciting once we got established, how pregnancy had changed everything, turning dreams into responsibilities overnight. Neither of us said the word love, but it hung between us like smoke, impossible to ignore even when we weren't looking directly at it. Instead, we talked around it, creating a careful architecture of shared memories and present longings that felt safer than naming what was happening. The secrecy that had seemed romantic at first began to wear on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I became hyper-vigilant about my phone, about explaining gaps in my schedule, about maintaining the careful performance of being a devoted husband and father. I started lying about small things, where I'd been during lunch, why I was late coming home from work, who I'd run into at the grocery store. Each lie felt necessary in the moment, but left me feeling hollowed out afterward, like I was carving away pieces of myself to make room for this double life. Fiona began to notice my distraction, asking if I was feeling all right, if something was bothering me at work. I told her I was fine, just tired, maybe coming down with something. She accepted these excuses with the trusting ease of someone who'd never had reason to doubt me, and her faith made me feel both protected and guilty in equal measure. The worst part was watching her with Liam, seeing how naturally she moved through her role as mother, how effortlessly she provided the stability and love he needed. She was everything a partner should be, kind, reliable, devoted to our family. The problem wasn't with her. The problem was that I was finally admitting I'd never been the person she thought she'd married. Late at night, lying beside her while she slept, I found myself staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine different versions of my life. What would have happened if I'd been braver at 18, if I'd told Desmond how I felt before he left town? What would happen now if I simply walked away from everything I'd built, started over somewhere nobody knew me as Owen the husband, Owen the father, Owen the hardware store manager who never caused problems or asked for more than he deserved? But morning always came with its demands and responsibilities, pulling me back into the rhythm of the life I'd chosen. Soccer games and parent-teacher conferences and discussions about whether we should refinish the hardwood floors this spring or wait another year. All the ordinary negotiations of family life that suddenly felt like they were happening to someone else, while the real me existed only in those stolen hours with Desmond, becoming more vivid and more desperate with each passing day. The revelation came on a Tuesday night in November, with Fiona lying beside me in the same position she'd held for the past hour, curled on her side, one hand tucked under her pillow, auburn hair spread across the white cotton like spilled wine. I'd been watching her sleep, studying the face I'd known for 15 years as if I might find answers written in the familiar lines around her eyes, the soft curve of her mouth that still smiled sometimes in dreams. When had I stopped touching her with tenderness? The question arrived with the brutal clarity of 3 in the morning, that hour when all your careful rationalizations crumble and leave you alone with the truth. I couldn't remember the last time I'd brushed her hair back from her face just to see her better, The last time I'd kissed her without it being part of some larger choreography of marital maintenance. Even our physical intimacy had become mechanical, a duty performed with the same reliable efficiency I brought to changing the oil in her car or replacing the filter in the furnace. She stirred slightly, making the small sound she always made when settling deeper into sleep, and I felt something crack open in my chest. Not love. I wasn't sure I knew what that word meant anymore, but a deep, aching recognition of everything I'd taken from her without meaning to. She'd married a man who was supposed to love her completely, who was supposed to wake up grateful every morning to find her there. Instead, she'd gotten me, a man who was learning, at 38, that he'd been playing a role so long he'd forgotten there was supposed to be someone real underneath it. The guilt was worse than the lying, worse than the stolen hours with Desmond, worse than the constant vigilance required to keep my two lives from touching. Fiona deserved someone who chose her every day, not someone who stayed out of habit and obligation and the terrible inertia of shared mortgages and Christmas traditions and all the accumulated weight of years spent building something that looked like love from the outside. I slipped out of bed and went downstairs, standing in the kitchen where Desmond and I had talked that first night, where this whole dangerous thing had begun. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. Liam's drawings covered the freezer door, stick figures of our family holding hands under a yellow sun, everyone smiling their crayon smiles. In his version of us, we were happy. In his version, we made sense. The next evening, Desmond was quiet in a way that made me nervous. We'd driven to the overlook above Miller's Pond, the place where teenagers still came to park and imagine they were the first ones to discover love in the back seat of their parents' cars. But instead of talking, he sat staring out at the water, his hands folded in his lap like he was trying to keep them from saying things his mouth wouldn't. "What's wrong?" I finally asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He turned to look at me then, and something in his expression reminded me of the boy who'd left town 15 years ago, uncertain, restless, already halfway gone. "I've never done this before," he said. "Been someone's secret like this." I told myself I wouldn't. "But I can't seem to stay away from you." The admission hung between us like a confession neither of us had wanted to make. I understood what he meant without him having to explain it. In Portland, in the cities where he'd lived since leaving this place, he'd been free to love whoever he wanted without hiding, without the exhausting choreography of separate lives and careful explanations. Coming back here, getting involved with me, meant returning to a closet he'd spent years learning to live without. "But it's killing me," he continued, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. "Watching you go home to her every night, pretending we're just old friends when we run into people in town. I feel like I'm disappearing again, like I'm becoming that scared kid who was too afraid to be himself." I wanted to tell him it wouldn't always be like this, that we could find a way to make it work without the secrecy. But the words died in my throat because we both knew the truth. In a town this size, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where my son played soccer with the children of my customers, where Fiona taught the kids whose parents shopped at my store, there was no such thing as a quiet separation from the life I'd built. There was only this, stolen moments and careful lies, or there was nothing. "You could leave her," he said, not looking at me when he said it. "We could leave. Start over somewhere nobody knows us. But you have to be sure, Owen. Really sure. I can't do this halfway anymore." The possibility hung in the air like a door opening onto a life I'd never let myself imagine. Waking up next to someone who knew all my secrets. Building something real instead of performing something safe. Living in a place where I could introduce Desmond as my partner without calculating who might be listening, who might judge, who might make our lives difficult in small but persistent ways. But leaving would mean abandoning Liam, and that felt like cutting off a limb. It would mean destroying Fiona's life, not just changing it, but demolishing the foundation she'd built everything on. It would mean admitting to everyone who'd ever known me that I'd been lying about who I was for nearly 20 years. I thought about my parents, who'd been so proud when I married Fiona, who sent Liam birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside, and called every Sunday to check on how we were doing. I thought about the men I worked with, who talked about their wives and kids with easy affection and assumed I felt the same way about mine. I thought about the careful web of relationships and obligations and expectations I'd woven around myself, and how pulling one thread might unravel everything. But I also thought about the man I'd been becoming in these stolen hours with Desmond. More awake, more present, more myself than I'd been in years. How laughing with him felt like breathing after holding my breath for too long. How touching him felt like coming home to a body I'd forgotten belonged to me. The choice wasn't between two people, I realized. It was between two completely different ways of being alive. One built on safety and obligation and the comfortable numbness of doing what was expected. The other built on truth and risk and the terrifying possibility that wanting something might actually be enough to make it worth having. Sitting there beside the dark water with Desmond waiting for an answer I wasn't ready to give, I understood that I was standing at the edge of my own life, looking down into depths I couldn't measure. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure which way I was going to jump. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in December, with snow falling outside the kitchen window and Liam at soccer practice and Fiona grading papers at the dining room table. I'd been standing at the sink, washing the breakfast dishes with mechanical precision, when I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The man looking back at me was a stranger, hollow-eyed, carrying himself like someone who'd forgotten how to breathe properly. I turned off the water and dried my hands on the dish towel Fiona had embroidered with sunflowers during one of her brief crafting phases. The same towel I'd used every morning for 3 years, worn soft from washing, cheerful in the way that domestic things try to be. But looking at it now, I felt something close to panic. How many more mornings would I dry my hands on this towel, in this kitchen, pretending to be someone I wasn't? Fiona looked up when I sat down across from her, pen poised over a stack of second-grade math worksheets. She'd been quieter lately, more watchful, and I wondered how long she'd been seeing through my careful performance. How long she'd been waiting for me to stop pretending everything was fine. "We need to talk," I said, and something in my voice made her set down her pen entirely. The conversation that followed was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Not because Fiona made it difficult. She listened with the same patient attention she brought to everything else, asking questions only when she needed clarification, never interrupting or getting defensive. But because telling her even pieces of the truth meant admitting to years of lies, years of taking her love and trust, and giving back only the hollow performance of reciprocation. I told her about feeling lost, about questioning everything I'd thought I wanted from life. I told her about Desmond, though not everything. Not the kisses or the late-night drives, or the way he made me feel like I was finally coming alive after years of sleepwalking. But enough. Enough for her to understand that this wasn't about her failing as a wife, but about me failing as a husband in ways that couldn't be fixed with counseling or renewed effort or any of the usual remedies for troubled marriages. She sat completely still while I talked, her hands folded on the table in front of her, watching my face with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a language she'd never heard before. When I finally stopped talking, the silence stretched between us like a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. "Do you love him?" she asked finally, and her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the sound of my own heartbeat. The question hung in the air like a door I could still choose not to walk through. I could have said no, could have told her this was just confusion, just a midlife crisis that would pass if we were patient enough. I could have promised to end it, to try harder, to be the husband she deserved. Part of me wanted to say those things, wanted to retreat back into the comfortable lie we'd been living. But sitting there across from the woman who'd shared my bed for 12 years, who'd given me a son I adored, who'd never done anything wrong except marry a man who didn't know how to love her the way she needed to be loved, I found I couldn't lie anymore. "Yes," I whispered. "I think I always have." The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, there were tears she was trying not to let fall. But her voice was steady when she spoke. "Then you have to go," she said. "Not because I don't love you, and not because I'm angry, but because staying would be cruel to all of us. To me, to Liam, to you, to him." The practicalities came later. Lawyers and custody arrangements, and the terrible logistics of dismantling a life we'd built together. But in that moment, sitting in our kitchen with snow falling outside and our son's drawings still covering the refrigerator, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. The crushing weight of pretending, of performing, of being someone I wasn't, began to lift from my shoulders. That night, after we'd told Liam that Daddy would be moving to his own apartment, but would still see him all the time, After we'd answered his questions with the careful honesty that 8-year-olds deserve, I called Desmond from the motel room where I'd checked in for the night. "It's done," I told him when he answered. I told her. About us, about everything. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with something I couldn't identify. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm free. We can leave," he said, and I could hear him moving around, probably pacing the way he did when he was thinking hard about something. "Start over somewhere. But you have to be sure, Owen. Once we do this, once we leave this place together, there's no taking it back. No pretending it was just confusion or a mistake you made. People will know. Your family will know. Everyone will know who you really are." The weight of what he was offering settled over me like snow, cold and transformative and impossible to ignore. Leaving wouldn't just mean starting over with Desmond. It would mean acknowledging, publicly and permanently, that the life everyone thought they knew me for had been a facade. It would mean walking away from the comfortable invisibility I'd hidden behind for 20 years and stepping into a truth that would follow me wherever I went. But I thought about the man I'd seen in the kitchen window that morning, hollow-eyed and half alive, and I knew I couldn't go back to being him. Not after remembering what it felt like to be real. "I'm sure," I told him, and for the first time in months, the words felt completely true. "When do we leave?" "Soon," he said. "As soon as you're ready." I looked around the motel room with its beige walls and generic furniture, this temporary space between one life and another. Through the thin walls, I could hear a television playing, someone else's ordinary evening unfolding in the safety of routine and predictability. A week ago, that could have been me. Another quiet night in front of the television, another evening of comfortable numbness. But sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear and Desmond's voice promising a future I'd never dared to imagine, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Terrifying, exhilarating, utterly real hope. "I'm ready now," I said, and meant it completely. The packing took less time than I'd expected. 12 years of marriage, 20 years of adult life in this house, and everything that felt essential fit into 2 suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes. Clothes, a few books, the watch my father had given me when I graduated college. The photograph of Liam from his first day of school, gap-toothed and grinning in a shirt we'd had to iron 3 times to get the wrinkles out. Not much to show for nearly 4 decades of living. But maybe that was the point. Maybe I'd been carrying too much for too long. Fiona sat at the kitchen table while I moved through the house, collecting the pieces of myself I wanted to keep. She'd been crying earlier. I could see it in the puffiness around her eyes. But now she was composed in that careful way she had when she was trying to be strong for everyone else. The divorce papers lay spread in front of her, neat piles of legal language that would transform us from husband and wife into something more complicated. Co-parents, former spouses, people who'd once loved each other in the only way they'd known how. Liam was upstairs in his room, supposedly napping, but probably listening to the sounds of his world being quietly rearranged. We'd explained it to him the way the counselor had suggested. Mommy and Daddy still love you very much, but sometimes grown-ups realize they'll be happier living in different houses. He nodded with the serious expression he wore when trying to understand adult mysteries, then asked if he could still have pancakes on Saturday mornings. The resilience of children, their ability to adapt to changes that would shatter adults, never ceased to amaze me. I found myself standing in the doorway of our bedroom, my former bedroom, looking at the space Fiona and I had shared for so many years. The bed where we'd made love and argued and read separate books in comfortable silence. The dresser where I'd kept my ties and cufflinks and all the other accessories of the professional man I pretended to be. The window that looked out onto the backyard where Liam had taken his first steps, where we'd barbecued for neighbors and talked about putting in a garden we never quite got around to planting. It should have felt more significant, this moment of leaving. More dramatic somehow, weighted with the gravity of destroying a family and abandoning the life everyone expected me to live. But standing there with my suitcases in hand, I felt only a strange lightness, as if I'd been holding my breath for years and was finally allowed to exhale. The hardest part was saying goodbye to Liam. He clung to me in that fierce way 8-year-olds do when they sense that something important is happening beyond their understanding. I promised him again that I'd see him next weekend, that we'd go to the movies and get ice cream, and do all the father-son things we'd always done. The only difference would be that I'd pick him up instead of being there when he woke up in the morning. But I'm going to miss you every day, I told him, and that was the truest thing I'd said in months. Whatever else I was walking away from, whatever mistakes I was making or corrections I was finally implementing, leaving him would always be the cost that made everything else feel complicated. He made me promise to call him every night before bed, to text him pictures of wherever I was going, to remember that his birthday was in March and he wanted a new bike. Simple requests from a child who didn't yet understand that sometimes adults had to choose between different kinds of love, different ways of being honest about who they really were. Fiona walked me to the door, carrying herself with the dignity she brought to everything else. At the threshold, she stopped and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I hope you're happy," she said, and I could tell she meant it. Not immediately, maybe, but someday. I hope this all makes sense in a way it doesn't right now. I wanted to tell her she deserved better than the half-life I'd given her, that someday she'd find someone who could love her completely instead of just performing the role of devoted husband. But the words felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of what we were dissolving. "Thank you," I said instead, and we both understood I wasn't just thanking her for her blessing, but for 12 years of patience with a man who'd been trying to figure out how to be himself. Outside, Desmond waited in his rental car, headlights off in the gray December evening. Snow had started falling again, the kind of fine, persistent snow that would accumulate slowly through the night, transforming the familiar landscape into something clean and unrecognizable by morning. I put my suitcases in the trunk and got into the passenger seat without looking back at the house. Desmond didn't say anything, just reached over and took my hand in the darkness, his fingers warm against mine. The simple gesture contained everything we'd been too careful to say out loud: relief and terror, and the fragile hope that choosing truth over safety might actually lead somewhere worth going. He started the engine, and we pulled away from the curb, headlights cutting through the falling snow as we drove past the hardware store where I'd worked for 22 years, past the elementary school where Fiona taught and Liam would finish 3rd grade, past all the familiar landmarks of the life I was leaving behind. I watched my reflection in the rain-streaked passenger window, seeing not the hollow-eyed man who'd been going through the motions for so long, but someone I barely recognized. Eyes wide and uncertain, yes, but alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Scared about what came next, but no longer afraid of who I really was. The highway stretched ahead of us, disappearing into darkness and possibility. I didn't know where we were going. Didn't know what we'd build together or whether we'd be strong enough to survive the weight of everything we were carrying. But for the first time in 20 years, I was moving towards something instead of just maintaining what I'd already constructed. And that felt like the beginning of everything.